Hi, my name is Mary Polton, and I will be presenting on Wayne C. Booth and the narrative perspective. So, I figured we'd just get started with some fun facts. So Booth, I thought he was, going to be some old guy from the 1800s, but he actually lived in, most of his works were published in the 60s and 70s. And he was actually the guy who coined the term unreliable narrator in the Rhetoric of Fiction, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then one thing I learned from a number of sources over and over is he really thought that the show don't tell method was really overhyped, which was kind of interesting to read. And then turns out he was LDS. So, like any good Utah LDS boy, he went to American Fork High School and he ended up earning his bachelor's degree at Brigham Young University. And then he went on to earn his master's and his PhD at the University of Chicago. He later taught English at Haverford College and Earlham College before moving back to the University of Chicago. So, Wayne C. Booth, as it turns out, was a prolific author. He wrote a lot of books. In 1961, there was the Rhetoric of Fiction, which, like I said, we're going to talk about in a minute. In which he presents a detailed examination of narrative technique and introduced such terms as implied author and reliable narrator. In 1974, he published both Modern Dogma and the Rhetoric of Assent, which had to do with some events that were taking place on the Chicago campus. So if you have a chance to look that up, it is actually him. It's not just like an instruction book on rhetoric, it is actually an example of really good rhetoric. In 1988, The Company We Keep offers a discussion of the place of ethics in literary criticism, and then he was the co-founder and co-editor of the Critical Inquiry from 1974 to 1985. And then I just listed some of his other books at the bottom. This is not all of them. He wrote a lot. But his voice is actually really engaging and entertaining at some times. So if you ever have a chance to check out his stuff, I recommend it. So A Rhetoric of Fiction. I chose to read the chapter on molding beliefs since it really applies to narrative perspective and the author's responsibility. So it discusses how many stories, and therefore their authors, reinforce values that we already hold or think we hold. And he talks about how not very many authors are actually brave enough to send, he calls it sending new messages. And this is a quote that explains it better than I can. He said, "Every reader knows, or thinks he knows, the value of true love, but the author cannot count on such general agreement to be lively enough for his purposes. By making us laugh at those imaginary fools who do not know love's true worth, he at the same time makes us value it actively in the precise form to be encountered in his book." So what he's talking about here is the messages that a story can send are not always sent through the hero. Sometimes they're sent through, the bad guy or the bumbling idiot off to the side that allows us to pat ourselves on the back and be like, oh, well, thank goodness I'm not like that. Kind of like Laman and Lemuel, as opposed to Nephi. Alright, so a really important part of narrative perspective is fidelity, which essentially comes down to asking the question of what messages or morals does this story support, or what does it intend to support? Because what it says and what it was supposed to say are not always the same thing. So Booth poses that there's actually a difference between reinforcing ideas of right and wrong and reinforcing ideas of good and evil. The danger would lie in the reader's ability, or lack thereof, to tell the difference. A modern example of this would be how in teen and YA fiction, there's a lot of thieves and pickpockets, Flynn Rider types, and they're portrayed as good, even though stealing is generally considered wrong. So to break it down with more Disney metaphors, because I'm all about that, one might watch Aladdin and learn that lying about who you are gets you in a lot of trouble, but when Aladdin steals a loaf of bread, it's really cool and justified. And, an impressionable kid might take the wrong message from that. That's not what it intends to do, but it could be the message taken from it. So in contrast to that, you have Les Mis, which definitely teaches the dangers of stealing a loaf of bread, while implying that lying about your identity can be noble and right. Coherence. Are your beliefs believable? So part of the appeal of narrative rhetoric is its ability to wrap that what otherwise might be a repugnant statement, such as stealing is really cool and gets you what you want, in a pretty bow. Knowledge of what appeals to your audience and what will make reading or listening more pleasant for them is crucial. That's where coherence comes in. So coherence has to do with the believability of the plot, the characters, the settings, the conflicts. One has to keep your reader on board long enough to absorb the message that you're trying to send. And we have another quote from Booth, which reads, "The skillful author will, of course, make his rhetoric in itself a pleasure to read. It is thus often difficult to tell whether a passage about values is present for its own sake, or as ornament, or a larger cause. In any truth discovery novel, and especially in novels which try to lead young people to the hard truths of adulthood, the problem is to make the discovery a convincing outcome of the experience." So that whole paragraph is basically just a really long way to say sometimes you gotta be really subtle about it, or people aren't gonna take your story seriously. Intention. So Booth postulates that morals do not have to be obvious to exist. Regardless of function, all stories send a message or make an argument. In Intruder, which is a book that he references frequently, as in many such works, the attitude towards which Faulkner wants his young hero to grow is so complex that neither the boy nor the reader is likely to infer it from the experience itself. So again, subtlety. And that's important to understand whether you are the speaker or the listener, the author or the reader. So another really important part of narrative perspective is form, and it can either be active or stative. An active expresses action of some sort. That would be, your events, what's actually happening. And then stative would be an expression of a state or condition. So an example, and it's, you kind of combine the two to get your story. So, Cinderella is in a state of rags, but after the glass slipper and the ball, which would be the active part of the story, her state has changed, right? Now she's a princess. And that combination of active and stative is part of what sends the message, part of what creates the consequence. So the question leading up to that would be, what is the cause and effect of the sequence of events? And then you always have to ask if the story presents a unified subject. Do the beginning and middle and end work together? Do they make sense? Does the cause and effect that you're trying to create make sense? Which goes back to coherence. Function. So another really important question to consider when analyzing or writing something from a narrative perspective is to ask what social function it fulfills for the audience. So this one also has a lot to do with intention. This one is usually purposeful. So stories can be for entertainment, they're just there to make people laugh, which can actually be really interesting because what people go to just for entertainment is where you're going to find the most subtle messages. Educational stories are, very often the moral, it will just smack you across the face. It'll be very obvious. And then elevation has to do with specifically trying to teach what Booth would refer to as enlightened principles. And in conclusion, Booth's main message in this chapter is that authors must take responsibility for the messages they leave, intentionally or unintentionally, in their works. He reminds us that one is not usually present to interpret his or her story for the reader, and so must be aware of the impact one's story will or can have. He also says that narration itself can be a character, and that the manner in which one tells a story, which would be your form and function, can send a message just as effectively as the content of the story itself. And he actually, at the very end of the chapter, he pokes a little bit of fun at a fellow author of his who released a story with some pretty immoral characters, and the way that he narrated it narrated the story kind of made it come across like the author supported these kinds of behaviors. And at one point, a couple years later, the author released a statement being like, hey, anybody who reads my book, that's not how I intended it. And Booth pretty much, laughs and says, well, if you have to publish a statement telling your readers how to interpret your story, you've failed to convey your message effectively. So that was just kind of a funny addition right at the end. So that's narrative perspective, and that is Wayne C. Booth.